The Strange Case of Voyager Flight 333. The cabin lights flickered overhead, casting uneasy shadows on the passengers seated in rows on Voyager Airlines Flight 333. Most were asleep, lulled into a false sense of security by the gentle hum of the engines. But for Emma Hayes, the unease was palpable, a tight knot in her stomach that refused to let go. She had flown countless times before, but something about this flight felt different. The plane was quiet, too quiet. And there was an odd tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. She shifted in her seat, trying to push the feeling aside, and glanced over at the window. The stars were out in full force, but there was no moon. She frowned. It was an odd detail, but her mind kept circling back to it. She turned her attention to the flight attendant who was moving down the aisle, her footsteps almost too soft. The woman's smile seemed forced, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Emma was traveling home after a long business trip. She was exhausted and eager to get back to her small apartment in Seattle. But as the hours ticked by, she couldn't help but notice that the flight seemed to be taking longer than expected. She glanced up at the digital clock on the overhead panel. They had been flying for over 6 hours, but they were nowhere near their destination. She pressed the button for the flight attendant, a soft ping echoing through the cabin. When the attendant reached her, Emma couldn't help but ask, "How much longer until we land?" The flight attendant's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, Emma could have sworn she saw something flicker in her eyes. "We should be landing shortly," the attendant replied in a voice that didn't quite match the calmness of her words. "The captain will give you an update soon." Emma nodded, but her instincts were on high alert now. She turned back to the window, but the view was no longer familiar. The vast expanse of darkness outside the plane seemed endless, stretching into infinity. There was no sign of the city lights she should have been seeing at this point in the flight. "Something's not right," she whispered to herself, her pulse quickening. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes, trying to steady her breath. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe she was imagining things. But the more she tried to shake the feeling, the more it intensified. The plane's engines seemed to hum louder now, an unsettling vibration running through the floor. A sudden jolt snapped Emma back to reality. The lights flickered once more, and this time they didn't return to full brightness. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, and Emma stiffened. "This is your captain speaking." The voice was eerily calm. "We have encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain in your seats. We'll be fine, but we may experience some irregularities in our course. Please remain calm." Irregularities? Emma's mind raced, her stomach twisting. She had been flying for years, and she knew turbulence wasn't usually an issue after such a long stretch of smooth air. What did the captain mean by irregularities? As the seconds ticked by, Emma's sense of dread deepened. She wasn't the only one who had noticed something was wrong. All around her, passengers were stirring, whispering in hushed voices. She heard one man talking to his wife in frantic whispers. "Did you hear that? The captain sounds strange. What do you think's going on?" Emma couldn't help but agree. She'd never heard the captain's voice sound so distant, as though he was speaking from a place far removed from the cockpit. She felt a strange compulsion to get up and find out what was happening. But when she stood, her legs wobbled, as though the very air around her had thickened. The lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. The plane was plunged into darkness. A low murmur of panic spread through the cabin, growing louder with every passing second. Emma fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. The air in the cabin felt stifling now, as if it were pressing in on her from all sides. And then she heard it, a soft, unsettling voice, coming from somewhere up ahead. It wasn't the captain's voice. It was something otherworldly, low and distorted. It seemed to resonate in her very bones. "Help us." The words seemed to echo through the cabin, not just in the air, but in Emma's mind. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively took a step back. The voice came again, and this time she saw something, a flicker of movement near the cockpit. Before she could move, the door to the cockpit suddenly burst open, and a man staggered out. His uniform was disheveled, his face pale and streaked with sweat. His eyes were wide, wild, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. They're here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "The passengers aren't, they're not who they seem." Emma felt her stomach lurch. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The man's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, he seemed to recognize something in her, something that made him look even more terrified. "We're lost," he said in a raspy breath. "We're not on the right course. This flight, it wasn't supposed to happen. And now they're coming." Before Emma could ask him what he meant, a strange chill filled the air. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, flickering in and out of existence. Then, with a sickening lurch, the plane began to tilt, spiraling into a nosedive. The shrill alarm of the autopilot screamed through the air, and the cabin descended into chaos. "Brace yourselves," the captain's voice finally broke through, but it was distorted, static-filled, like a broken transmission. The entire plane shook violently, and Emma could hear screams erupting all around her. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was the sound of the strange voice again, whispering in her ear, "Help us. Help us. Escape before it's too late." When Emma woke, it was to complete silence. The plane was no longer in the air, no longer falling. She opened her eyes, disoriented, and found herself lying on the cold, hard ground. The world outside was bathed in the faintest light, an eerie glow casting strange shadows across the barren landscape. The passengers were gone. The crew was gone. And then, standing before her, was the captain. But his face was no longer human. "We never left," he said, his voice a hollow echo. And in that moment, Emma understood. She wasn't just on a plane anymore. She was in the void, and it had been waiting for her.